In the previous lecture, we transitioned from a catalog of the various kinds of governments and kinds of princes there are into a look at the prince, and especially the prince and the way he fights for or defends his state. Machiavelli is very much interested in war. He wrote a book called The Art of War. His biography of Castruccio Castracani is a biography of a great warrior of the 14th century. He is very much interested in the military side of things. And if you recall, where we left off last time is that Machiavelli said there are three kinds of armies you can have. You can have your own army, made up of your own citizens, and that's good. You can have mercenary troops, a bought army, a rented army, if you will, and they're always bad. And there's a third kind of troops, auxiliary troops. Auxiliary troops basically are those you borrow. And, as we saw last time, the good example of that is that Cesare Borgia won the Romagna largely with French troops that his dad, the Pope, had arranged for him to be lent from the French king. And so, having rejected mercenaries, what we talked about at the end of the last lecture, let's look a little bit at what he has to say about auxiliaries. He says, you lose no matter what the outcome of battle if you have auxiliaries, because if they lose a battle, you are destroyed. If they win a battle, then you, the prince, become their prisoner. So if you win, you lose, and if you lose, you lose. And so auxiliary troops are of no value. And Machiavelli, as he so often does, cites several examples of nations that have not done well because of their reliance on auxiliary troops. Here's one of the places, though, that's sort of odd, where all the examples are modern. Certainly there are illustrations from antiquity, but Machiavelli really focuses in on his own time. And he lists three leaders, three political territories that have suffered because of the reliance on auxiliary troops. Pope Julius II, the successor, more or less, of Cesare Borgia's father, Alexander VI. The city of Florence, which relied on auxiliaries from time to time, and the Byzantine Empire, which after all had come to an end in 1453. Machiavelli looks around. Why did the Byzantine Empire come to an end? There are lots of answers, but one of the answers is they didn't have their own troops. They relied on auxiliaries. Machiavelli knew this, by the way, from his own study of the history of Florence, because there was an ecumenical council held in Florence in the 1430s that Cosimo de' Medici sort of organized, and it tried to bring about the reunion of the Greek and Latin churches because the Greeks knew they were going to fall to the Turks unless they got some military help from the West, but they weren't going to get any help militarily from the West as long as the Eastern and Western churches were in schism. And so although that council on the surface was about religion, to a great extent it was about politics. And even though an agreement was reached in Florence, that agreement was never essentially ratified back home in Constantinople. And therefore, there was not the kind of military presence that was needed in the Byzantine Empire to overwhelm or at least drive away the Turks. Now, Machiavelli also draws an interesting comparison between mercenaries and auxiliaries. He says mercenaries are dangerous because they're cowards. You're out there in the battlefield to get a paycheck, and you might say, hey, damn it, this is dangerous. I don't want to get myself killed for a paycheck. So cowardice is very common among mercenary troops. However, Machiavelli says, it's when the auxiliary troops fight with courage that you're in trouble. Okay, it's when they really do fight hard. And so every kind of army except your own has fatal disadvantages. And one of the most interesting passages, I think, is what Machiavelli writes in this context about Cesare Borgia. Remember, Cesare Borgia conquered the Romagna with French troops, but then tried to install his own. Let me read you this passage from The Prince. I shall never hesitate to cite Cesare Borgia and his actions. This duke, remember he was also known as Duke Valentine, this duke entered the Romagna with auxiliary troops, leading an army composed entirely of Frenchmen, and with them he captured Imola and Forlì. But not considering such troops reliable, he turned to mercenary forces, judging them to be less dangerous, and he hired the Orsini and the Vitelli. When he found, in managing them, that they were unreliable, disloyal, and dangerous, he got rid of them and turned to his own men. This is a guy that had all three kinds of armies. And again, Machiavelli knew him up close and personal because he had been part of a Florentine diplomatic mission to Cesare Borgia. And therefore, although, as we saw, Cesare Borgia is someone Machiavelli looks to, we need to remember that Cesare Borgia ended up losing everything. Nevertheless, on this particular point, which Machiavelli sees as so crucial, and where Machiavelli thinks the Italy of his own day is so wrong-headed, Cesare was right on. And therefore, here he praises Cesare Borgia. His last comment on these different kinds of soldiers, and in particular on auxiliaries, is interesting because he turns to a period he doesn't discuss very often, the end of the Roman Empire in the West, the end of what we would call antiquity in the West. And he says, as I look at the collapse of the Roman Empire, what do I attribute it to? I think the first sign of destruction of the Roman Empire, Machiavelli says, is when the Romans hired Germans, Goths, to guard the frontier. Remember, Rome had some natural frontiers, like the Atlantic Ocean, for example. The empire also had tough land borders, the Rhine-Danube frontier being the most important. And for a while, especially after some depopulation in the Roman Empire, the Romans found themselves bringing Goths across the Rhine in particular and sort of semi-Romanizing them and hiring them. And what they hired them to do was go fight the rest of the Goths to defend the Roman Empire against their fellow Goths as soldiers in pay of Rome. And so this is a bad idea. It was a bad idea in antiquity. It's a bad idea now, Machiavelli says. Interestingly, in the 18th century, when the fall of the Roman Empire got its classic interpretation from Edward Gibbon, if you say, well, take that 2,000 plus page of book of Gibbon, what did Gibbon see as the reasons for the decline and fall of the Roman Empire? Okay. Number one was barbarians coming from the outside, and of course the weakness was that the barbarians were being called upon to fight against the other barbarians. And secondly, it was the nature of Christianity taking over the Roman Empire. So in that way, in many ways, Machiavelli anticipates what Gibbon is going to say in the 18th century about one of the major reasons for the collapse of Roman authority in the West. Machiavelli then continues to talk about the prince as a soldier and a commander of soldiers, but he changes topics. War, he says, is the principal art of a prince, and it must ever be on his mind. I guess the way we would say that today is a little bit different, that the number one job of the commander-in-chief is to provide for the security of the people whom he, or now she, may govern. And so Machiavelli says, let's talk about the prince as a warrior and as a warrior chieftain. How do you prepare yourself for war? How do you train? What do you do to be ready when military action is needed? Well, two things. Exercise. You need to be strong because, if you will, the prince as commander-in-chief in those days didn't sit in an office. He was on the battlefield, and therefore you needed exercise. And the second thing you needed was study. You needed to read, you needed to observe, you needed to think. Here's a list of some activities that Machiavelli says are vital for a prince, especially in times of peace. Hunting is a good activity for princes because you get some exercise, you're riding around on a horse, but also you're getting to know the lay of the land. You're getting a feel for how hard it is for a horse to make a turn or go up a hill or down a hill or cross a stream or whatever it might be. Because in hunting, you really have a sense of what you and your animal, and therefore this military unit, can and cannot do. And that's very important because I think Machiavelli is suggesting how many people have planned strategies militarily without thinking about the lay of the land, without thinking about what the capabilities are of the various animals that are going to be carrying the soldiers. And so hunting is a good way to practice. It's a good way to sort of stay in shape both physically and mentally, he argues. Secondly, he says whenever a prince is traveling, and princes move around a lot, we need to remember, they need constantly to look at the land, and they need then to imagine. I'm riding along on the road and I say, now look there, look at that hill. Now, if there were enemy soldiers on that hill, what position would I want my troops to be in down here? Or where might be the place where they are most vulnerable? And where's the place in this landscape that I would be most vulnerable if I had my troops? And so you're constantly exercising your mind. You're not riding along off to the next town for whatever purpose, listening to your whatever the 16th century version is of an iPod. What you want to be doing is thinking, planning, imagining, scheming, strategizing, conceptualizing, because you don't have time to do on-the-job training. When you are at war, when you are besieged, or when you need to attack, that's not a good time to start thinking, gee, how do you deal with troops that are stationed on top of a hill? Or how do you get across a particular body of water? And how do you look for a place to ford the stream? That's not a good time to do it when the other guys are out there. And Machiavelli knew a lot about battles that Florence had been involved in, as well as other city-states in Italy, as well as the history he had read. To know that, you need to be prepared. You don't start thinking about war when war breaks out. When you do, if you're not doomed, you're certainly at a disadvantage. And then Machiavelli says, let's talk in a more formal way about what princes should study. Because princes should read. What should they read? First and foremost, they should read history. Now, history certainly means something a little bit different than it means to most of us today. Today we think about intellectual history and social history and cultural history and economic history. We think about the history of common people, where we might read about a labor movement or whatever. That's not what Machiavelli means. He means history in a more political and military sense, because most history that was written, including Machiavelli's own history of Florence, as we shall see in subsequent lectures, is about leadership and it's about military activities. You know, you read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, for example, and you say, gee, what are women doing at this time? After all, women take on different roles. Women's lives changed during the Peloponnesian War, as well as the men who were actually out in the field. You would hardly know that from reading Thucydides. He focuses on the politics of war and the battles that took place in the war. That's sort of the heritage that Machiavelli is inheriting from the classical history he knows. And so you need to read history. You need to see what princes were successful militarily and what the causes of their success were. You obviously, contrarily, need to look at the princes who failed and figure out what the nature of their failures were. Furthermore, Machiavelli says, we need to remember that some of the greatest military victors in history have consciously seen themselves as following in the footsteps of predecessors that they read about. And one of the examples that Machiavelli gives is that Julius Caesar modeled himself on Alexander the Great. And so it is very important to look at the past and to learn from the past. Now, as we're going to discover in later discussions of Machiavelli, this doesn't just mean go see what Julius Caesar did and do exactly as Julius Caesar had done. Doesn't mean that, because, of course, no two situations are exactly the same. And therefore, you may learn a strategic hint, a strategic idea from a great military prince of the past. But that doesn't mean you do exactly what he did way back then, because you've got to always take into account what's the principle behind that action, and maybe that principle requires a different specific choice or action today than it did then, because the world isn't the same. That you may look with admiration at Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar or any other one of these folks. But, hey, if you're in Italy, you're not conquering the Persians. And if you're in Rome, you are not necessarily doing what Julius Caesar did. You may have the same landscape, but politically the situation is different. Technologically the situation is different. So although Machiavelli here urges the study of history and imitation, we're going to see how much he reflects on that and how much he refines that notion, both in the discourses and also in the histories of Florence that he writes. Even toward the end of The Prince, he's going to come back to this issue a little bit. Again, in finishing this section, Machiavelli makes the point that you study for war during times of peace. That is the proper time to prepare, to think, to strategize, to imagine, to study. When those guys come over the hill invading your territory, you don't say, gee, let me get out my history book and do a little thinking about how I should fight. That's not the time you do that. You do it in times of peace. Machiavelli then turns to, in one of the most famous passages of The Prince, a sort of reflection on the kind of political science that he is creating here and how it differs from the past. I want to read you an extraordinarily important passage. This is at the beginning of chapter 15 of The Prince, just a few lines into the chapter if you're following along in the text. Many writers, he says, have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen nor known to exist in reality. For there is such a distance between how one lives and how one ought to live that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done achieves his downfall rather than his preservation. A man who wishes to profess goodness at all times will come to ruin among so many who are not good. Therefore, it is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity. Well, let's break that down into the two main components. First of all, he said, in the past, a lot of folks have written about places that we'd like to have, places that there ought to be. Now, automatically, it seems to me, what comes to mind to most people who are familiar with the Western tradition is Plato's Republic. Although no doubt here he's also referring at least as much to Cicero as he is to Plato's Republic. Now, he doesn't say, throw those books away. What he says is, though, they're a different kind of inquiry than I'm making, because their goal is to define what ought to be. My goal is to define what is, to see how the world works right here, right now, and then figure out how to act in it effectively. I'm not about the oughts of the world. I'm about the this is the way things are. And this is a real shift because, as Machiavelli says, if you follow that line with me, then what we know is that you've got to learn not to be good. In Plato's Republic, obviously you need just rulers. Justice is the topic of Plato's Republic. If you had to reduce Plato's Republic to one word, it would be justice. Cicero, the prince needs to be loved. The prince needs to be virtuous, needs to live according to honesty and kindness and whatever. Machiavelli says if princes live like that, given the way people are, they're going to lose. They're going to be defeated. And let's not forget, Machiavelli really cares about this. The states that they govern are going to be open to attack, and they're going to become chaotic. And so what a prince needs to learn to do is not be good sometimes. And then it doesn't mean you go out and start not being good. What it means is if you know how to be good, then you need to know next when not to be good. Okay, you may know what it means not to be good, but you may always be good because the times may never require you not to be good. You have to be really lucky, probably. But it is not something you automatically do. You say, I've learned not to be good. Now let me go out and show everybody I know how not to be good. you need to use that knowledge carefully, and you need to use it with a goal in mind. That Machiavelli here is making a very interesting point about what we would call political realism. Now, Machiavelli then raises the question, what happens if, in fact, you are not good and, well, this is going to happen, people notice it? Machiavelli says it's all right for a prince to have a reputation for those vices without which he could not preserve his state. If you have to be a little bit cruel, then you'll survive with the reputation of being a little bit cruel. I remember in the 1960s, Margaret Chase Smith, senator from Maine, at that time the only woman in the Senate, at a time of a great deal of civil unrest in the United States, said on the Senate floor that if people are given a choice between chaos and despotism, they'll choose despotism every time. They'll choose a strong leader rather than anarchy. And Machiavelli is basically saying here that if a prince is able to preserve his state and keep order by being not good sometimes, it's okay to do that, and it's okay even to have the reputation of doing that. That people don't look to their princes as moral models. They look to their princes for order and stability and protection. And it's very important for Machiavelli to make that point. And then he uses, remember I talked about this earlier, the term virtue in the way I'm going to describe it now, in the traditional way. Remember, there are two ways to talk about virtue. Virtue, this sort of manliness, is sort of what you need to do to preserve the state. But also, we know that virtue retains its traditional meaning, sort of the, all the nice things that you are. And Machiavelli says apparent virtues often lead to ruin, while apparent vices lead to success. Okay? Being not good is an apparent vice, but it can lead to success. Being kind is an apparent virtue, but it can really mess up the world. It can really mess up the state you're in. So we need to distinguish between what appears to be true virtue and the reality of what is virtue. And Machiavelli is going to come back to this point more times in The Prince. We're going to look at a passage later on that's going to focus in on this issue of apparent vices and virtues and real vices and virtues. Machiavelli then turns to another quality of princes, and that is generosity. Again, a traditional virtue, especially for Cicero, that princes should be generous. Machiavelli says, let's hold on. Those people, those princes who win a reputation for generosity will usually fail because of what they have done to gain that reputation. Now think about that. In other words, I want to be seen as having the traditional virtue of generosity. And so what do? Well, what does it mean to be generous? You give a lot of stuff away. You hand out things here and there to various people or to all the people, depending on exactly the kind of state you have. But, Machiavelli says, to do that, to live out according to that apparent virtue, is going to really get you in trouble. Let's talk about why. Sumptuous behavior, which is one way that some people would define generosity, will win a reputation for generosity, but it'll be too costly. If you give a lot of stuff to everybody, guess what? You run out of stuff. Or, if you don't run out of stuff, you've got to go get the stuff that you're then going to give away. What will that mean? Well, the example Machiavelli gives is if you are too generous because you're working hard to develop a reputation for generosity, if you're too generous, you're going to need to raise more revenue. Now, how do you get more revenue? This is easy. Okay, we don't need to go back to the 16th century to know this one. You raise taxes. But remember what Machiavelli said way at the beginning. It's very important for princes to have the people on their side. Now, we all know this one too. How do you lose the support of the people? Read my lips is the answer to that question. That is to say, if I, as the prince, in a way of sustaining the development of my reputation for generosity, say, well, in order to do that, I've got to tax you more. I've got to take a bigger percentage of what you make, your income, your property, whatever the basis is for taxation. You'd be surprised how quickly I'm going to lose my reputation for being a good guy, despite the fact I have a reputation for generosity. Generosity isn't going to save me. Okay, here are the choices. Would you rather have a prince who is just lavishly generous, or would you rather have a prince that keeps taxes down? Okay, that's the question, the way Machiavelli puts it. And Machiavelli says the people will choose not having higher taxes, not having more of their property confiscated, because most people never think they get their confiscated property back. They see it going someplace else. And so Machiavelli here is making very careful observations about the fact that successful princes need the support of the people. Remember, people are less fickle than the nobility. Less fickle than the nobility. And therefore, you need the people. If you try to create a positive image of yourself by being exceptionally generous, you'll ultimately end up taxing more the very people whose side who you need to be on your side. That's what happens. And so Machiavelli gives a very interesting and careful observation about the need for being very careful with the wealth that you have to spend as prince. And Machiavelli gives several examples of successful princes who had reputations for being miserly. They're all contemporary examples. One is Pope Julius II. Again, he was Pope in the late part of, or the rather very beginning part of the 16th century. He dies in 1512, if I recall, maybe 1513. So Julius II is a good example of this. The kings of France and Spain in Machiavelli's own day are good examples of people who were miserly, who had a reputation for being miserly, and who were nevertheless successful. In fact, he says a reputation for being miserly actually helps princes be successful, not the sort of common sense notion that, gee, I need to look generous in order to be successful. I remember a few years ago, I was on a panel for the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we were helping to decide who was going to get certain grants. And I remember taking my position of miserliness. I said, here's a grant proposal. Gee, if it was just me, if it was my money, I'd fund this. But this is not my money I'm helping to decide. This is the people's money. And I don't think the citizens ought to be sponsoring this. I might think it's a good long shot proposition, but I don't think that's something I, as a citizen, should be investing in. And so I tried to make that distinction. And essentially, it's a Machiavellian notion that when you're handling somebody else's money, that is to say the people who pay the taxes, you better be damned careful with it. Now, Machiavelli then goes on to say, when the prince spends his money and the money of his people, he should be tight-fisted. But if you get somebody else's money, meaning you conquer a territory and win some wealth, you get certain spoils of war, then you should be generous. Be generous in spending other people's money. Be tight-fisted spending your own and the money of your citizens. And so what we see here in this section of The Prince is that Machiavelli, after having looked at the number one job of the prince, which is security, which is to take care of the principality, to prepare for war and to execute a war plan if and when necessary, we now turn to those other qualities that allow the prince to govern successfully. Because, after all, being simply a military guy, being a tough guy, isn't enough. You need the support of the people. How do you get the support of the people? You need to have a base of power that even if you have a great deal of authority, even if you've taken a territory by force, hey, you got to govern it. And what won it for you won't keep it for you. And so we see here, and in the next few chapters we'll be looking at beginning in the next lecture, we're going to see how Machiavelli is molding an image of the prince as someone who not just conquers a territory, but actually orders it, administers it, as well as defends it.